I've always wanted to do that. Okay, welcome to another professional lunch at the Foreign Correspondents Club. It is my great pleasure. My name is Andrew Horvath, by the way. I'm a former president of this club. It is my great pleasure to introduce Bill Emmott. And it's a great pleasure because Bill Emmott does not need a long introduction. You all know who he is, and that is why you are here. So all I want to say is that he's here having given a keynote speech at the Japan Institute for International Affairs. As you may have seen in the notice that went out, Bill has a track record of getting things right. In 1988, I think, or 89, he predicted what would happen the following year, which is the bursting of the Japanese bubble. Now he is here to tell us that Japan's future is in female hands. And let us hope that he is as right about that as he was about his first prediction. And he will tell us now why. So, as you all know, Bill is a former editor of The Economist. He generally turns out one book every 2 years, which is about the rate at which I read them, so it's very convenient. So, thank you, Bill. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for your kind introduction, and thank you all for welcoming me back to my old club. I'm a former secretary of this club, and I'm glad that I didn't do enough damage to have ruined its future. So I'm delighted to be back and honored that you should all spare time to be here. These days, I live in Ireland, as a refugee from Brexit. I'm an exile, a Brexile in Ireland, and therefore it's a great relief not only to be living in Ireland and being away from the British general election, which happens next week, and secondly to be here in Japan and to be talking about Japan rather than Britain. I should mention that in the British general election campaign, we are, in my country, choosing between a man, Boris Johnson, who is a proven liar, and whose family actually have become so ever-present, father, daughter, brother, other brother, and this one, that they've been described as being Britain's mixture between the Kennedys and the Kardashians. I think they're more like the Kardashians myself, but there we are. In thinking about them, I remember from my time here as a foreign correspondent in the 1980s for The Economist, I think a justice minister actually, making the very accurate point, however, that to expect ethics from politicians was like expecting to find fish in a vegetable store. And I've always remembered that comment, and I guess it's what we should remember in Britain. So, as journalists, we have to, in the face of things like our election and others, we have to do our best to obviously hold people to account, to find the truth and ask our awkward questions, of course. But also, I think we have to do our best to look beyond the day-to-day issues to try to see underlying trends and to try to identify what's really going on rather than all the noise, and identify what's important. These days, as a long-distance observer of Japan, that really is what I can try to do and to offer, what I can climb on the shoulders of experts who I come and talk to here, but if I contribute something, it's to say what I think, out of the many interesting things, what I think are the most important issues, and what are particularly for the future. So I thought I'd briefly, of course, advertise 2 recent books, but also say why I think these issues are important for the future of this country, and then look forward to hearing from you, many of whom are much more expert on these issues than I am. And I do think that the 2 most important issues for the future of this country, as when people ask, well, is Japan going to prosper and thrive over the next 10, 20 years? The right answers are, one, about the international position in which Japan finds itself, and that way was the subject of my talk this morning at the JIIA conference about the fate of the West and Japan's position in the Western network in its current condition. And secondly, I'll devote more time to the point that Andrew introduced correctly about the more female future that I believe Japan will have. But the question that will be important is how more female it will be, to what extent organizations of all kinds will embrace and adapt to this more female future to make it a really positive issue or not. So let me just talk briefly about the Western issue, just because I don't think one can ignore the outside world. And also because the funeral today of former Prime Minister Nakasone brings that to mind. When I was a correspondent here, alongside Mr. Horvat here, we are, of course, students of the Ron-Yasu relationship in those days, and Prime Minister Abe's father was foreign minister, and I, of course, cannot resist mentioning that when he spoke at this club in a professional luncheon about his omnidirectional diplomacy, and Professor Horvat here asked a question. Afterwards, the foreign minister's spokesman came up to both of us, actually, because we were standing together, and said to Mr. Horvat, he said, Andrew, you are still asking the same stupid questions, aren't you? So we are all still asking the same stupid questions of the Don-Shinzo relationship and the situation that Japan is in. But today, the situation is, of course, very different. What I tried to argue this morning in my remarks at JIA is that not only is the coherence of the West under challenge thanks to Brexit and to the fact that the United States is not just the unreliable partner, but rather an actively hostile partner to many of its allies. But also, we are now in a G2 US-China world, back in a world of dual superpowers, but not dual superpowers where we can take clear sides, but rather a world of dual superpowers where the interplay between these two countries affects us all. We need deep relationships with both of them, but we have to find ways to mitigate the effect of what they do on us. We are all small countries now, just some of our countries haven't yet realized it. And of course, in the case of my country, it's trying to become a smaller country by leaving the European Union. But it does mean, I think, that the international relationships that all of our countries have to become not just more important, but a bit different. What we need our relationships with America, with the United States, but we need America plus. We need a sort of network between ourselves, based often on values and on our liberal democratic histories, but one that, because of our relationships with each other, makes us more important potentially for the United States and for China to treat us seriously in the future. Madeleine Albright liked to call, when she was Secretary of State in the 1990s, she liked to call the United States the indispensable nation. I think that Japan and the United Kingdom and Ireland and others have to see themselves as being indispensable interlocutors for the United States as for China. that we are not just rule takers, we're not just going to be pushed around by these two countries. But that ability to not be pushed around in this new G2 world depends both on our relationships with each other, which I think are crucial, and which I would say the Abe administration has been more effective than many previous administrations in building on those international relationships and building not just the EU-Japan relationship, but actually also a closer relationship with the UK bilaterally and its multilateral efforts elsewhere, but also our internal values and our internal strength, which make a difference to how vulnerable we are, how attractive we are in terms of our soft power, and how cohesive can be the public support for those international positions. And that's why I think, one of the reasons why I think the second most important issue, apart from Japan's role in this evolving Western network, that alongside that, the internal strength of Japan depends very much on the issue of gender equality, which is the biggest single component of the issue of how this country uses so-called human capital, human resources. A cliche that is still a cliche but also correct is that, of course, this is a country with no natural resources but only human resources. In my time as a correspondent here in the 1980s, we rightly observed that Japan's management of human capital was actually superior by global standards in terms of the quality of education and the way in which companies used employees and developed them throughout their careers. But of course, we were only talking about men. We were only talking about half the population. We were not talking about the whole of the population. Nowadays, looking at the use of human capital in this country, I think that there's 2/3 of the question about the use of human capital is about gender equality, and 1/3 is about the use of both men and women in the evolving, insecure employment system that you have. So why? And I've just put a few bits of data that I like to think of as important, but you will tell me whether they actually are, I hope. Let's see whether I'm pressing the right button. There we are. So I think the fundamental chart about the evolution of Japan during Heisei is this, that the growth of non-regular employment, non-regular short-term and part-time employment, which has broken the sense of security that so many employees had. Now, of course, this produced the so-called Ice Age generation of male graduates who couldn't find the secure jobs that their parents would have expected. And so that Ice Age generation is principally male. In the later periods, a larger part of the non-regular employment is female. That has, I think, been connected to the much written about phenomenon of a declining marriage rate because of the declining ease of family formation. Plenty of us write about cultural factors surrounding marriage in all countries, including this one. But I think as an economist, I have to say that as well as culture, there is also money. And financial insecurity has, I think, been a large component of the changing nature of marriage here. But what the government boasts about, of course, is this chart, the overtaking of the labor force participation rate of the United States, of female labor force participation by Japan over the last 2 years, and the general rise in female participation in work. And that is a significant phenomenon, because it is true that in economic performance, if you can throw more labor into the economy, then you will get a higher GDP, but you won't necessarily get higher living standards, and it depends on the quality of use of that labor. This emphasis on overtaking the United States also, I think, reflects the kind of long habit of looking bilaterally as a point of comparison, rather than looking more multilaterally. If we compare female employment in Japan with a wider range of countries, we see that Japan's rise of female participation has indeed been significant, overtaking the average level in the euro area, but still well behind Britain and Germany, for example, and certainly even further behind the Scandinavian countries. So there's probably a way to go in increasing female employment. But the big question, as many of the real experts in the room know, is not about quantity, it's about quality. If we look at the ratio of women in leadership positions in this country, we see Japan with a very, very severe lag compared with other OECD advanced societies. We see certainly the famous World Economic Forum gender gap rankings, where the only comfort is that South Korea is even worse. We see the very low level of female leadership in managerial jobs, depending on how you define leadership, but nevertheless at a very low level. But we should, I think, see the underlying change as being not simply an immovable resistance to female leadership, but rather a reflection of education and the gender gap in the 1980s. The current generation of leaders, thanks especially to prevalence of age-related hierarchies, were those who graduated from universities in a period when there was such a gigantic gender gap in access to four-year university courses, i.e. during the 1970s and 1980s. At my JIIA conference this morning, you could see and yesterday, you could see that it was like 90% men and maybe 10% at most females, but that's partly because I was lowering the average age anyway of the men, and I'm 63, because of course the sort of people who will typically go to that conference are people who did graduate in the 1970s and 1980s. So we had then only a little over 10% of females, graduates of high school, going to four-year university courses, but a dramatic change in the 1990s and 2000s as girls and their families moved away from two-year junior colleges and towards four-year university courses. Still a gap, but a pretty small gap, and therefore a terrific change on the supply side, if you like, or from a labor market point of view, of a vast increase in the number of tertiary educated women coming through. This is not wholly reflected in changes at the top national universities, which disproportionately educate the very top leadership, of course. The gap between female share in private universities and the top national universities, and notably Todai, remains very substantial. That 20% nearly at Todai is probably a roughly 4 times what it will have been only 15 years ago, but nevertheless, it's still a huge gap. So the question now is what will happen as that supply of tertiary educated women come through the labor market, come through career patterns, come through into potentially leadership positions. In my view, and the reason I worked on this book that Andrew kindly mentioned, that is published this year in Japanese, next year in English, I have to complete the rewrite for the English audience, who know much less about the country than you do and than the Japanese audience do, but it will be published next year. The reason I did it was because I do think that the way in which Japan grasps the opportunity of having had the narrowing of that educational gap and such a substantial increase in the, if you like, the educational quality of the female human capital is the biggest single thing that will make a difference between merely surviving and actually thriving, between having the internal strength that I mentioned, or really being somewhat disappointing. The path that we see is one where you have a considerable change in the availability. I started on this book, and I've chosen many case studies of achievement among earlier generations. One of which was happened to be one of only a very small number of female ambassadors who happened to be in Ireland until last summer, Ambassador Miyoshi. And when she graduated from Tokyo University in 1980, she was not only a rare female student at Tokyo University, but also she was the only female recruit among the 28 diplomatic track recruits. Just to take a snapshot, in 2016, there were 10 female recruits versus 18 males. There will be a dropout rate from that, especially if the Gaimesho doesn't change its human resources and promotion structures sufficiently to adapt to a need to employ in a more family-friendly way. But nevertheless, the supply of future female ambassadors has greatly increased. Mariko Bando, the doyen of like gender equality campaigning and gender equality work, now president of Showa University, predicts that the number of female leaders will double over the next decade. That would still be from quite a low base. I think that the real question is whether it can treble as this great supply of extra people come through. There are heartening signs of younger elevation than in before, and in particular in new economy type companies. Among my case studies in my book was Kono-san, president of Rakuten Ichiba, the only female board member at Rakuten, but nevertheless quite a superstar there. I did, though, also feature Shinoda Toko, on whom I think there are a number of prints in this club. The reason I featured her was because part of the initial idea from the book came from when I was traveling on a boat in Norway and happened to be sharing a journey across a fjord with someone who turned out to be an art dealer for Shinoda-san. She mentioned that Shinoda-san had a book out the previous year that sold 500,000 copies, and I felt jealous. And therefore I thought I'd better meet her soon. And here she is, still producing her wonderful art. So the question, I think, for the future, and which is why I emphasize its importance, really is the degree to which this will, the increased supply will be embraced. The path that Japan is on is exactly the same path as other countries have followed. The same struggles in dealing with glass ceilings, in adapting corporate organizational cultures, in reducing misogyny, in dealing with sexual harassment, are all still experienced in other advanced countries, and we've all gone through them at different times and with, I would say, different levels of success. We can be divided in Europe and North America into those who have moved faster and further on this path and those that have moved slower and less profoundly, but we've all moved. What's the equilibrium level? Well, a great scholar of this issue at King's College London, Dame Alison Wolfe, who's an expert both on education and on gender issues, gender employment issues. In her book, The XX Factor, 3 or 4 years ago, she thought that a roughly equilibrium level of, if you like, leadership, thanks to given family choices and others, was around 30 to 35% female. And that was because she was thinking about it in her generation, and she's about my age, as having come from, as it were, a low base, and you shouldn't set too high a level. But I think I don't know what the equilibrium level will be here, but what I do know is, and do feel, is that this question of how well human capital is used is going to be, I think, the crucial thing that I will be watching, if I'm lucky enough to be continuing to be able to study the evolution of Japan's economy and society and politics. It is an issue that relates also to non-regular employment of both men and women. If we ask ourselves why has household consumption been so weak, why is that also true in Italy, in France, to some degree in Germany, in other countries? It is because of the emergence of dual labor markets, of the creation of a cheap labor pool through ultra flexibility, but also lower levels of training, and therefore also a decline in the labor share of income and a rise in profits. So that is a shared phenomenon across our countries, and a shared solution should be, in my view, direct intervention in labor markets by governments, both to raise wages at the lowest level, through minimum wage legislation, and through interventions like the Work Style Reform Act last year, which can have a long-term effect, and by intervening in the sort of contract law surrounding the security of jobs. I don't think that it's inevitable that we should be in this environment. But alongside that, and a much larger influence will be how well organizations, say of all kinds, whether they are universities, whether they are small companies, whether they are big companies, whether they are government ministries, how well they will alter their corporate cultures and human resources policies, recruitment and retention policies to not just exploit but accommodate, provide the free choices to the greatly increased supply of tertiary educated women and other women in the future. Can I predict what it's going to be? No, of course I can't. But I can say that I think it's the single most important thing that we should all watch and that I should watch. And I hope that this will become, as it is already becoming, the number one socio-economic issue here. So I'm going to stop there and listen to you real experts telling me what's really happening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you for filling in on what I should have said is that Bill's book on Japan's far more female future will be available from Oxford University Press in June, I understand. Although I think everyone here reads Japanese and can go out and buy the Japanese version, which is, I can tell you, is fun to read because it's full of interviews with very clever women. Now let me open the floor to questions, first to working press, and then later to those with pressing work. Thank you. Let me just start off. Takerubu-san, お願いします。じゃあちょっとお立ちになって、はいはい。You have to identify yourself by name and affiliation, or if you're a freelancer, that's fine too. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your nice presentation. My name is Mieko Takenobu, and I'm now a free journalist. And I'd like to ask you, how do you evaluate Abe's Women Shine policy? Because my friends always tell me that Abe's Shine policy seems to them, shine, S-H-I-N-E, means shine in Japan and die. because many women have to work very hard by the policy, and at the same time they have to make babies because Abe tell them to have baby more and more. And working time is very long, so they have triple burdens. So that's why they feel Abe's shine policy, Shine policy. And what do you think about Abe's policy? And could you tell me the reason, please?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that the real issue is about having greater choices for women rather than telling them to do one thing or another. Maybe there are incentives to do things that can be done. So if you ask what is government policy, it has to be to increase the range of choice and then to offer incentives to particularly to maybe better choices rather than worse ones. So what has the government actually done? The answer is not a lot. I think that much of the rise of female participation is independent of government. It's nothing to do with the Abe policy, it seems to me. That's a response by women to a need for income and to demand in the labor market for particularly part-time and often low-paid jobs. I don't think it's much to do with Abe government policy. That said, central government and local government have genuinely made quite a considerable investment in childcare facilities that have made a difference. I think it probably needs to be a lot more than it is now, considerably more, but there definitely has been a genuine investment in that. What the government didn't do is to substantially change the tax threshold for married women. I mean, for the so-called marriage tax, which while they adjusted the level a bit, they didn't change the fact that that the tax system still acts as a quite strong disincentive to work in higher paid employment or for longer, and so traps many women in part-time and low-paid work. So I think the government part of the process has had a moderate impact, not always positive. So what's really been happening is nothing to do with the government, would be my view. Mostly it's been to do with women's choices and corporate choices. Which has been, again, both positive and negative. And connecting all of this to the birth rate seems to me to be outrageous. Otherwise, what's that got to do with anyone? It's none of their business.
Okay, Haruko.
Andrew, thank you very much. Haruko Watanabe, HKW. I'm a long-time member of this club for about 40 years. I realize, or you realize also, Japan's woman power more or less started flourishing after 1975, which is United Nations Year of Women. And during this women's decade, Japanese government and a little bit of corporate try to promote women. So in order to realize women power in Japan, Japanese women, skillful, intelligent women should first work outside of Japan and then come back to Japan if they offer the best position. As you see, there are many women journalists here who work for the Foreign Correspondent Office. They are very successful now. This is one of the proofs. And after they prove themselves, and then they can be very successful as freelancers. Japanese government needs a global trend and global push, global pressure to bring Japanese women. Thank you.
Haruko-san, is this a question?
Yes, because Bill Emmott mentioned about quality and quantity. And what do you think is the best way to bring this quality and quantity? And my comment is to work outside of Japan first. What do you comment?
Okay, I agree with that. It's already the case that as a share of the, unfortunately, small number of students, university students who go outside of Japan for more than just a short, like 3-week or 1 week or 2-week language course, the share of those who go out for a significant period, most of them are women already. Probably 80%, but I don't mean, already, but this is a dominant share of a very small number, and it's very good advice but then it would be good advice to men too, it would seem to me, to go out and come back, in other words. But yes, I think women need all the weapons they can get, and languages and international experience are among the weapons available to compete in this difficult world. I agree.
So, Machiko, please. I mean, Osa Machiko sensei. ごめんなさい。
My name is Machiko Osawa. I've been analyzing about women's participation of Japan in comparison with the United States, and my question is that, I think in your book, you mentioned about the lack of innovation, that during the last 20 years, the Japanese economy has not grown much, and the other economies has grown more, and so that is one of the reasons I think you wanted to write this book. And I think that given the situation right now, that the very difficult that because it's so easy to employ non-regular workers, so that rather than the company to improve the productivity, they can rely on more non-regular workers. So what Japanese society is doing is asking older men to work long years and delay the paying the pension, and more women to work part-time, so that I agree that women is the key to improve the productivity of the Japanese economy, but what is going on right now is not what is supposed to be. So I think if there's stronger restriction of working hours, and also that, of course, the tax reform is necessary, and so that pushes the company not to rely on non-regular workers. And I think the government is not doing enough. And I want you to be critical to the government. And I think that your voice is very important for Japanese economy to improve the productivity and enforce the further growth. Thank you.
So thank you. That wasn't a question, but I think it was advice. What do you say to that?
I will say, I'll say two things. One is that what little I know about this issue, I've mostly learned by reading and talking to Osawa Sensei. So thank you very much for your guidance on this. Secondly, yes, you're right. The basic fact is that we are supposedly in the period of rapid technological progress, of innovation of all kinds, and yet we see that evidence everywhere except in productivity statistics, and we do not see the apparent benefits of technological change happening. Why not? Because actually of the choice of using, as it were, cheaper, unskilled workers is available, and because companies are able to choose not to invest in productivity enhancing capital, and not invest in training people to be able to use and exploit such capital, and probably public investment in the sort of infrastructure that helps that has also been low. So I think that the point you make is absolutely right, that if we are to really prosper in this age of technological innovation, we need to have government policies that incentivize companies to change their cultures and their structures to use and develop employees more productively, most of whom who could be used more productively are women, but not only. Fundamentally, these changes have to happen in companies and other types of organizations. It's not really available for government to dictate this question, but they can provide more of a framework for it.
Some more questions from press people, please. Yes, go ahead. Thank you.
Siegfried Knittel, freelancer from Germany. Yesterday I came to a press conference here. It was about recruiting young students and employee in companies. And it showed me again that there is a lack of respect of women in employment, and when the employer want to engage new staff, they want to a lot of in many cases the women the staff who want to recruit people are looking for a sexual relationship with the students, and they invited them to at home and these kind of things, and it's not. It means it's a lack of respect of, and I think this is still a part of the employment system in Japan, that women are not really respected, and so it is one reason I think they cannot make a career. It's a hindrance to make women a career in Japanese companies because they are not respected.
And I think that that's true. It's been true in other countries as well. It's not. This is not. This is a. You know, the saying is that this is a story as old as boy meets girl. This is a story as old as powerful boy meets weaker girl. And that's basically the way it's evolved in other countries as well. What changes it is, I think, a critical mass of female managers that once you can reach that point, then you can start changing that dynamic of respect or disrespect. But don't let's kid ourselves. This doesn't happen quickly, easily, or universally. You know, is this? I'm sure there are countries where this has been achieved much better and faster than is the case here. But would women actually say that this works in a way that is proper equality of respect? I'll bet you that they probably don't, because we're in a slow evolution in this direction. But I think that what is going to be important is the emergence of a critical mass of female executives, female leaders, female supervisors amongst, within male organizations, that then change the way in which decisions are made and by whom the decisions are made, and change, therefore, the power structures. And that's what we have to welcome and watch for. And so my hope about that supply of more women coming through in potentially leadership positions, and indeed emerging into leadership positions, is that will change, that will produce a critical mass that then has an accelerating effect in creating a difference of atmosphere. But there's no doubt that it ain't there now. But that's because we're dealing with the world of the 1970s and 1980s in terms of leadership.
Okay, well, since I don't see hands, yes, are you a working press? Okay, just 1 second, please. I'm going to use the chair's prerogative.
She's pointing at
yes,
someone,
sorry. Who? I work at some. Okay, please go ahead. Is working press or? Yes, please. Working press, yes.
No, maybe I misinterpreted.
Okay, sorry. All right. Well, in that case, I'll ask a question which I've been meaning to ask, which I hope is something also on your minds as well. Bill, you interviewed almost 30 women, if I'm not mistaken, for this book. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yes, that's right, yes. So did you have a sense that they shared your optimism towards the future? What was your general impression if you had to sort of give a kind of a bottom line? Do you think that Japanese women distinguished the ones who were gifted and talented, the ones that you have interviewed, feel the same sense of general optimism and look at the fact in the same way that you do, or do you have a sense that perhaps maybe they are somewhat pessimistic? What is your view?
Okay, well, of course, the choices that I was making were selecting people who had succeeded in different ways. So they were the ones who were more likely to be optimistic than otherwise. So if there was a general conclusion, it would be that those stories that I explored and people I interviewed who had succeeded in creating, if you like, their own reality, their own organization, because they'd started up a company, or they were running an NGO, or they were in a situation where they could, relatively speaking, control their environment, were much more optimistic than those in larger organizations. And that's because they were, say, more able to deal with the immediate issues surrounding them, and more and less, if you like, needing to confront the entrenched obstacles of organizational culture. But yes, certainly a general sense of positivity and of to want of a better word, agency, that the ability to make choices and create opportunities being much greater for them than for their parents. And so I'd say that sense of pessimism, yes. Optimism.
It's optimism. Yes. Okay, so another thing that came across is that both in your talk and in your book, that you're looking essentially at universalistic issues as opposed to essentialistic, meaning unique Japan.
Yes.
And I know that both you and I, in many, many years, have always confronted Japanese apologists who said, well, you don't understand because everything in Japan is unique. In fact, it is uniquely unique, as you know. Have you encountered people who, in the face of the facts that you present, and you say it is inevitable, just as the bursting of the bubble was inevitable, that this too is inevitable, do they turn to you and say, you don't understand because Japanese women are just so warm and cuddly, they wouldn't want to become president of anything?
Yes.
Okay.
Of course, I suppose is the answer. But I mean, fewer than you might expect, because I was essentially interviewing women rather than stupid men who would have said that. But certainly, of course, men say that. But they say that in every country.
Okay. Well,
in that way.
So
yes.
That too is universalistic then?
So exactly. I think universalistic would be my conclusion.
Okay. You had a question. Yes. Could you please identify yourself and yes, thank you. And I hope it is a question, yes.
Yusuke Wada, associate member, running a couple of Germans here at FCCGA. As you said about the critical mass of women and also about the university roles entrance in Japan. Today I brought you Dr. Ruriko Tsushima here. She's probably one of the most famous lady gynecologists in Japan, also running the chairman of Oirase Summit, which is the enhancement of women's role in Japan. My question is, there's been a problem about the bias of university entrance exams in Japan of women. Could you give us your opinion, please?
I think that they're biased. Yes, that's my opinion. No, I mean, I think, so when I give this kind of presentation outside Japan, the thing that most surprises audiences, in my experience, is the inequality of women in medical professions. Why are they surprised by that? Because actually in many European countries, more doctors are women than men. Not everywhere, but I mean very substantially, medical profession has been a profession in which women have typically made faster advances in most advanced countries compared with other roles. And so people kind of are surprised by that. And I think the point that you make about a bias in the university access, and therefore a bias that is the consequence of structural issues in the health system, is essentially the explanation. Now then there are issues about STEM subjects and study in high schools, which can make a difference to those national university entrance exams, and the ability of female students to get access even to non-scientific courses in Tokyo University and others, given that they have to take a center test, the national exam test, in which they have to do a science subject, and yet in relatively speaking, the gap between girls and boys in STEM subjects in Japanese high schools is much larger than it is in many European countries. Indeed, it's the other way around in some European countries. So I think there is the further issue of those national university entrance exams and the role of STEM. But that comes back to high school teaching.
Thank you, Rob.
Okay. Yes. Is there a hand? Yes, please go ahead.
Frank Packard, associate member. I'm not asking a trick question. I honestly don't know the answer, but you brought a lovely global perspective. You live outside. You've talked with reference to many other countries. In your experience, do quotas work? Do quotas for women in professions, quotas for gamusho entrance, do they work in other countries? Do you have any insight about whether they could apply here?
I think that they work in a limited way. So I think that they have to have a sunset clause, is my perception. In other words, they work to be able to jumpstart a process of building a critical mass. The way that they've been talked about, which is particularly, and indeed in other countries, quotas for board directorships, seems to me that the most pointless form of quotas, since that doesn't change anything in the company anyway. But other sorts of quotas, including for, let's say, faculty members or whatever in universities or other things, would seem to me can work to jumpstart a process and accelerate a process, but you'd better be changing some of the underlying forces behind it, because otherwise you end up with a system that alienates everyone. So I would say that they need to be handled with a lot of care.
Follow-up questions, anyone from... is there somebody there?
So there's a number over here.
Yes. Somebody at the very back, please, who's got a hand there. Yes.
The lady there.
The
Yes.
lady there, yes.
Thank you very much. My name's Joan Anderson from Sokogakkai International. Thank you very much for your talk on this very important topic. I just wondered if you have any ideas about what role the media can play, particularly in kind of amplifying the voices of younger women in particular, and the sort of dilemmas and issues that they're facing. And that would apply both in Japan and around the world, if you have any thoughts on that. Thank you.
I mean, the first surprise to me also, I mean, on this issue, I mean, rather related to my comment about doctors, is that until I started to pay attention, I hadn't realized how bad the gender imbalance was inside the media. In other words, inside media companies. Again, typically, because media work typically is more flexible and with less clear hierarchies in a lot of countries, women have advanced more quickly in the media in other countries than in other professions. And that then has changed to some degree, the way in which media women are represented, and therefore you get the transmission effect that you're talking about. Because media companies here are more kind of bureaucratic, hierarchical, relatively conservative organizations in their structures, that really hasn't been particularly the case. So the very low representation of women in senior media, in senior like executive roles in the media, just beginning to change for the same generational reasons that I talked about. But the result of that is that the representation of women's issues in the media is also not advanced, I would suggest. Now, it's hard, you know, there I am living in Europe. I'm not exactly reading or watching Japanese media on a regular basis, but from listening to other people talking about it, it doesn't feel to me as if there has been that change. And of course, the media does and should play a big role in altering the way in which this issue is thought about and felt inside a society, but it can do so both positively and negatively. And I'd say for much of this time it's been a negative influence.
Okay, I think you have some comment that you... wait a minute. One person here. Yes. Yes, go ahead.
My name is Atsushi Yamakoshi. I'm Keizai Koho Center. Thank you very much for your very interesting talk. I think the shining of women is very important in Japan. But how about the shining of men? Are you going to write a book on the shining of men?
Why?
How do you think about shining of Japanese people, regardless of men or women?
Well, I think yeah. So it's a good. Okay, it's a fair question. I think that put it in excessively economic terms, the use of human capital has deteriorated in the Japanese economy. It's deteriorated because more people are in non-regular employment and therefore are not trained and developed through their career, and therefore don't have the same opportunity to shine, and are more likely to be in relatively low-paid jobs, and that, as the effect of that is like unisexual, or whatever the right term is, that both men and women are not given the opportunities, the choices, and the chance to shine, that the men at least would have been given those opportunities in 1979 or 1989. That it's worse now in 2019 from that kind of human development point of view, and that is definitely independent of gender.
Do you want to take one final question?
So
that gentleman there who's going to talk about himself.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, there's a young man at the back as well.
Okay,
or
young man at the back. No. Just a second.
Or the... Oh, actually, why do... Yes.
Yes.
The gentleman in the front, should I? No, please, yes, go on. Yes, please.
Yes. This is going to be short and a question, right?
Okay, very short. Mitsuya Goto. I'm now a life member of this club and an ex-Nissan executive.
I remember.
Who was under the influence of Mrs. Thatcher for 22 years. Now, your Prime Minister, May, is gone, and Boris Johnson is calling for a new election. How is he going to handle Brexit?
Well, so the election is next week. The opinion polls suggest that unfortunately he is going to win. I say unfortunately because I feel he's badly qualified to be our Prime Minister. If you could put him in the same sentence as Margaret Thatcher, it shows the difference between, you know, the way my country's political class has fallen, that we have him as our choice. But what he's going to do with Brexit is that the Parliament, if he wins a majority, will pass his divorce agreement with the European Union, and then he will negotiate a trade agreement during the next 12 months. This will be the first trade agreement in history in which the two partners negotiating an agreement have started with identical trade arrangements and are negotiating about how to diverge from one another. All previous trade agreements are between countries that are different and are negotiating about how to become closer. We are just negotiating how to become more different. And that will be quite a difficult negotiation. So I think that he's over-optimistic when he says it will be done within 1 year. It will take a lot longer because it's quite a complicated arrangement. But there's no incentive to fail to come to an agreement. Second point, he and his party share, apart from some aspects, what they share with the Trump Republican Party is an interest in deregulation. And so I think that they will particularly seek changes, divergence from the European Union in deregulation areas that may benefit some sectors, such as pharmaceuticals, such as bioscience and engineering to allow genetic modification and so forth. And those sectors will prosper. But in the end, we will come to some kind of agreement, and then Britain will spend the next probably 25 years regretting having left the European Union, because we will actually be trying to get closer again, because we are geographically so linked. So, but how he manages it obviously depends on his success in the general election next week. But some people have said, the important thing is to get Brexit done and finished with. And the right answer to that is, no. Brexit is like watching a box set of a long TV series. And the bad news is that you've only watched the first episode. There's going to be another 10 episodes. And you are condemned in Britain to watch the next 10 episodes. The good news is that the rest of the world can move on to other things.
Well, we will move on to other things unless there are other questions. Well, I will ask one more, and that
What's the young man at the back?
Young man, no, yes, yes, thank you.
Unless you want to do. I don't want it. No. Have choice.
Hello, Albert Siegel, freelance. I mean, so you spoke a lot about government policies in university level education, but the thing is that most women build their identities as children in Japan. It has all this role playing for children where you know about growing up to be the housewife and such. So do you think that there should be any change in really how women are brought up even from a young age?
Where were you born?
I'm born in Miami, the U.S.
In the U.S. So you're the country of Ken and Barbie, right?
Basically, yes.
Yeah. You've answered your question.
Well, I'm 40. That was a while ago. I don't know how things are these days, but
no, right. But I mean, of course, I think that these things are inculcated in schools and elsewhere. And I think that for all of us, our societies, there's an evolution that we need to go through to a different set of kind of depictions of ourselves, but not entirely avoiding or moving away from what free choice is, what from people's natures that they want to be. But definitely, you're right that it's an aspect of every part of our education. I think you're right. But Barbie is part of the story.
I think that there was a Japanese version, in fact, several Japanese versions of the same thing, including one doll whose father was French, I believe. So that, but it was, I think that was one of those things where the toys were actually ahead of international thinking than the rest of the society. Bill, I just want to thank you very much for coming and for raising the level of discourse at this club by several notches. And in order to make sure that you do that again, please, here's another 1-year honorary membership. Please come to the bar where we need you to lower the average age. Just like
I don't think so. No longer. Thank you very much.